close your eyes and imagine the Atlantic wind carrying the salt of the sea into the manicured gardens of Newport, Rhode Island. The year is 1895, and the lawns are emerald perfection, the hedges trimmed to military precision, the gravel drives swept clean for carriages that glint like black lacquer under the summer sun. Above it all rises a palace, not in Paris, not in Vienna, but here on the American coast. Stone imported from Europe, carved into arches and balustrades, towers that catch the light like something from a French chateau. This is the Breakers, the crown jewel of the Vanderbilt family. If you had stood on these lawns during the Gilded Age, you might have thought you'd stumbled upon royalty. And in a way, you had not kings or queens, but something just as powerful in America's new world, the tycoons. The Vanderbilts were America's royal family, their empire built not on inherited crowns, but on rails, steam, and an iron will that could bend a nation's commerce to its will. They owned the rails that carried the lifeblood of the country, steel, coal, passengers, from coast to coast. They hosted parties so extravagant that European aristocrats whispered about them over champagne in London salons. But tonight, the candles are lit and the music is beginning. Step inside one of their ballrooms. 1,000 points of light glimmer from crystal chandeliers, pouring gold over gowns imported from Paris. Silk, satin, and diamonds move across polished marble floors in slow, practiced turns. The air hums with the scent of roses brought in by the hundreds, replaced every day so that no bloom was ever allowed to fade. Here is where deals are struck, not in ledgers or boardrooms, but in whispered conversation between dances. It is easy, standing here, to think this wealth could last forever, that this dynasty, these railroad kings, would stand for centuries like the monarchies of Europe. And yet, you and I know what they do not. This fortune, the greatest America had ever seen, will vanish. The palaces will be sold, the heirs scattered, the power dissolved. To understand why, we have to start long before this ballroom, before the carriages and the champagne, before the marble floors were even quarried. We must go back to a small farming village in the Netherlands in the mid-17th century, where a man named Jan Eerters Vanderbilt decided that his future would not be found in the low, flat fields of home. But before we follow him onto that wooden ship bound for the New World, pause here in this imagined ballroom for a moment. Look closely at the faces around you. You'll see them again, some in triumph, some in scandal, some in ruin. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the host tonight, is at the height of his power. His wife Alice, glittering in silk the color of champagne, is a queen in all but name, her posture regal, her diamonds catching the light with every graceful tilt of her head. Around them circulate cousins, siblings, sons and daughters, each one a branch of the dynasty. And beneath the music and the light, there is something else. Ambition, sharp as cut glass. Every guest here knows that the Vanderbilts are not just rich, they are the richest. That the gold leaf on the ceilings and the silver in the dining room were paid for with the sweat of an empire that began with one man's stubbornness and cunning. The Vanderbilts are still climbing now, still reaching higher than kings. But empires, whether crowned in gold or steel, always have fault lines. And this one, for all its glitter, is no exception. We will watch it rise, we will see it dazzle, and then we will watch it fall. Step away from the chandeliers, away from the velvet and champagne. The music fades. The year melts backward through decades, the glitter replaced by the creak of wooden docks and the salt-stung air of a much rougher harbour. The sky here is the same Atlantic grey, but the shoreline is nothing like Newport's manicured perfection. This is New Amsterdam, 1650, a place still smelling of wet timber, fish and wood smoke, where fortunes are measured in barrels of grain and a number of hands to haul them. On the deck of a Dutch ship, a young man grips the railing as the wind pushes against his back. His name is Jan Eerters, a farmer's son from the village of Vanderbilt in the Netherlands. He has traded the safety of his family's land for something far more uncertain, a passage to the New World, paid for not with coins, but with his future labour. Jan is an indentured servant, and when he steps onto these muddy docks, he will owe years of his life to a man he has never met. For most, this arrangement is a gamble with little hope of winning. Many die before their debt is paid, but Jan survives. He works, back bent, hands raw, until the debt is gone. When the English arrive in 1674 and rename the colony New York, Jan's family name is altered too. Vanderbilt becomes Vanderbilt, an anglicized twist of their Dutch origin. It is a small change, but history often hides in such small changes. The Vanderbilt name, born of the flat green fields of Diebilt, will one day be etched in gold on railroad stations and carved into the lintels of mansions. But for now, it belongs to men who work the water, ferrying goods and people across the island's rivers in weather fair and foul. Generations pass. The Vanderbilts remain close to the water, operating ferries along Staten Island. They are not rich, but they are known. Men who understand tides, wind, and the art of moving people from one shore to another. That knowledge is a kind of capital, even if it is not yet measured in dollars. And then, in 1795, another Cornelius is born. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man who will take this quiet workman's skill and turn it into an empire. But when we first meet him, he is not an empire builder. He is the fourth of 9 children, sleeping in a modest home, helping his father with the family ferry, his bare feet gripping the damp wood of the deck. School is not for him. He leaves at 11 to work full-time. It would be easy to miss him entirely, to look past this wiry boy and never guess that his name will one day be synonymous with unimaginable wealth. But there is something about Cornelius, an energy, a hunger, the way his eyes follow the wake of another captain's boat, already imagining how he could run it faster, cheaper, better. One day, at 16, he borrows 100 from his mother. It is a sum so large for the family that it might as well be a gamble with their future. He buys his own small boat, the Swiftsure, and begins ferrying passengers himself. The other captains notice him. The speed of his hands on the ropes, the way he pushes himself to make more trips in a day than anyone else. They give him a nickname, the Commodore. He wears it like a crown. This is where the story truly begins. Not in a ballroom, but in a boy's determination to own his own vessel, to control his own course. The breakers, the Triple Palace, the Biltmore, all of it will grow from this single decision, a young man in the salty air deciding that enough is never enough. The chandeliers will return soon enough. But before the glitter, there will be sweat, smoke, and the sound of engines on water. And Cornelius Vanderbilt will learn how to dominate them all. The Hudson River in the early 1800s was a living artery. Steamships churning its grey waters, sails snapping in the wind, ferries cutting slow paths between shorelines where cities were beginning to take shape. This is where Cornelius Vanderbilt sharpened his instincts. He was not a man to be content with a small route or a steady, modest profit. He was always watching, calculating, seeing every rival's timetable, every shift in the tide, and plotting where he could push harder, faster, longer. By his late teens, the Commodore was more than just a nickname. It was a reputation. In the taverns where captains gathered, they spoke of the Staten Island boy who could work a boat like it was an extension of his own body, who would ferry passengers in weather that sent others back to port. And behind his hands-on skill was something even more dangerous, a mind that saw opportunity in every obstacle. He learned quickly that business was not about the boat you had, but the deal you struck. Ferry routes could be bought, rivals undercut, prices lowered until competitors bled, and then, when they were gone, raised again to make up the difference. It was a game, and Cornelius loved it. From the outside, it was just ferries. But to him, it was proof that you could turn motion into money, that the control of movement, people, goods, resources, was the control of power itself. And once he understood that, he began to look beyond the waters of Staten Island. In time, he would command ships that span the coasts, control steam lines to Central America, and dictate the price of crossing an ocean. He would battle monopolies and create his own. He would live to see his name feared in boardrooms and whispered in drawing rooms. But at this point in our story, he was still just a man at the wheel of a ferry, leaning into the wind, his mind already far ahead of the horizon. The contrast is almost impossible to believe. From this wind-chapped, salt-stained youth would come the Grand Central Depot, the mansions of Fifth Avenue, and the sprawling summer palaces in Newport. From this boy's calloused hands would come fortunes so large that they could buy dukedoms, fund universities, and keep hundreds of servants on staff year-round. And yet, as you will see, the very traits that would make the Vanderbilts unstoppable would also plant the seeds of their undoing. The relentless ambition, the hunger for more, always more, the belief that the rules were for other people. These traits would build an empire of steel and stone, and then hollow it from the inside. So we return, for one last moment, to the glittering ballroom where our story opened. Imagine it again. The light, the music, the faces of heirs and heiresses who have never scrubbed a deck or worked a tiller. They are the inheritors of Cornelius Vanderbilt's will, both the fortune and the mindset that created it. Some will grow it, some will waste it, some will twist it into forms that Cornelius himself could never have imagined. The music swells. The dance continues. The Vanderbilt name shines like polished silver in the glow of the chandeliers. But if you listen closely, beneath the laughter, the rustle of gowns, the clink of crystal, you might hear something else. A faint echo from the harbour, the slap of waves against a ferry's hull, the sound of oars pulling toward an uncertain shore. The past is still there, under all the gold leaf, whispering a truth the family does not yet see. Fortunes rise. Fortunes fall. And no family, not even America's royal family, can outrun the tide forever. Before there were chandeliers and marble staircases, before the name Vanderbilt carried the weight of billions, there was a small Dutch village called Gilded. It lay in the low, green heart of the Netherlands, where the wind came in off the North Sea and the land was a patchwork of fields crisscrossed by canals. Here, in the middle of the 17th century, life was measured in harvests, tides, and the steady, unremarkable rhythm of rural labour. It was from this quiet place that a young farmer's son named Jan Eerts made the decision that would begin the long chain of events leading to America's so-called royal family. His reasons for leaving are lost to time. Perhaps poverty, perhaps restlessness, perhaps the magnetic pull of rumours about a new world across the ocean where a man might rise higher than his birth allowed. Whatever the cause, the choice was irreversible. The year was 1650, when Jan boarded a ship bound for the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. He could not pay for his passage in full, so he signed himself into indentured servitude, an agreement that meant years of labour to repay the debt. The voyage was hard and dangerous. Storms rolling across the Atlantic, cramped quarters, the sharp smell of salt and sickness in the air. Many who set out on such journeys never reached their destination. But Jan did. When he stepped off the ship onto the muddy, crowded docks of New Amsterdam, he entered a settlement that was little more than a trading post with ambitions. The air was thick with the smell of fish, tar, and wood smoke. Rough timber houses leaned against one another as if bracing against the wind. Ships came and went with furs, tobacco, and salted fish. This was not the world of dukes and gowns. It was raw, new, and demanding. Jan worked off his debt in sweat and calluses. We do not know exactly what labour filled his days. Perhaps hauling goods from ships, tending animals, or repairing the ferries that moved people across the wide rivers surrounding Manhattan Island. What we do know is that he survived. And in the colonies, survival was often the first and most important form of success. In 1674, the English seized New Amsterdam from the Dutch and renamed it New York. Along with the change in rulers came a change in Jan's name. The Dutch Vanderbilt, meaning from de Bilt, was anglicised into Vanderbilt. It was a small linguistic shift, but it would be this name, in its English form, that would one day be etched into the stone of railroad stations and whispered in the gilded halls of society. Over the following decades, the Vanderbilts did not rise quickly. They remained close to the water, making their living in ferrying and small-scale trade. They were not aristocrats, they were working people. They knew the currents of the harbour, the moods of the wind, and the best way to coax a boat through choppy waters. Their wealth was in skill, not in gold. This maritime connection became the quiet foundation of the family's future. Ferries were lifelines in a city spread across islands and peninsulas. To know how to run one well, reliably, safely, profitably, was to hold a kind of local power. The Vanderbilts were not yet wealthy, but they had something just as important in early New York, a reputation for competence. Life for them was a cycle of tides and trade winds. The city around them changed slowly. More ships in the harbour, more houses climbing up from the shoreline, more languages spoken in the streets. Wars came and went. Colonies changed hands, but the work remained, moving people and goods from shore to shore, always watching the horizon for the next customer, the next shipment, the next opportunity. And then, in 1795, another child was born into the line. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man who would take this modest, hard-earned knowledge of boats and trade and transform it into an empire so vast that his descendants could live like kings. But before he could do that, he would first have to learn every inch of the world his forefathers had mastered. The water, the wind, the weight of cargo, the balance of risk and reward. This is where the next chapter of the story begins. Not with silk and diamonds, but with the slap of waves against a wooden hull, the call of gulls over the harbour, and the stubborn, unshakable work ethic of a family that had been moving people across water for over a century. The Staten Island of 1795, when Cornelius Vanderbilt was born, was still a rural place. The skyline of Manhattan was a distant collection of steeples and masts. The island itself was farmland, scattered cottages, and quiet coves where ferries tied up to weathered wooden docks. For most who lived here, life was predictable. You worked the land, you tended the boat, you stayed in your place. Cornelius's father operated a small ferry service, hauling passengers and goods between Staten Island and Manhattan. It was not glamorous work. The days began before sunrise, the decks slick with dew, the wind sharp in winter and heavy with summer heat. But to the boy watching his father steer through fog and current, there was a kind of magic in it. Not the magic of fairy tales, but the magic of control. On the water, a man could command his own course. School never held Cornelius's attention. He left formal education at age 11, trading ink and paper for ropes and oars. By then, he already understood the rhythm of the harbour, when the tide would turn, which captains were worth befriending, how to load cargo. So a boat rode steady in the waves. He also understood something else. Speed mattered. A faster boat meant more trips in a day, and more trips meant more money. It was here, on these simple ferry runs, that he began to develop the instincts that would make him one of the most feared and admired businessmen in America. He watched the way his father negotiated fares. He noticed how weather could be used as an advantage. When other captains stayed in port, a brave one could win customers. And he saw that people were willing to pay for reliability as much as speed. By the time Cornelius was a teenager, his ambition was already showing. At 16 years old, he borrowed $100 from his mother, a staggering amount for a working family, to buy his own small sailing vessel. He christened it the Swiftsure, a name that promised exactly what he intended to deliver: fast, dependable crossings. From the first day, he worked as though every trip might be his last. He loaded passengers quickly, kept his craft in peak condition, and ran in all weather short of outright storms. Other captains began to take notice. He was not just another ferry boy. He was a competitor who seemed to have no fear of long hours or hard conditions. It wasn't long before they began to call him the Commodore. At first, it was a nickname, half respect, half good-natured jab at his intensity. But Cornelius wore it like a title. It set him apart. Even then, he understood the value of reputation. The Commodore was not just a boatman. He was someone you trusted to get you across faster and safer than anyone else. Every coin he earned was reinvested. Better sails, stronger hulls, larger boats. The same principles his Dutch forefathers had lived by, reinvest, expand, never waste an opportunity, were now being applied with a sharper, more ruthless edge. Cornelius was not content to work for someone else or remain a small player. Even as a teenager, he was watching the horizon for the next opening. He began to venture beyond simple ferry routes. Freight runs, special charters, and competitive bids for routes other captains held. Nothing was off limits. In the harbours and taverns, his name began to circulate. Not yet in the halls of power, not yet among the merchant princes of New York, but among the men who knew the water. The kind of men who understood that a competitor like this was either going to become your ally or your downfall. Cornelius Vanderbilt was still years away from railroads, grand stations, and the unimaginable wealth of the Gilded Age. But the habits were already there: tireless work, strategic reinvestment, and an instinct for turning opportunity into dominance. The boy from Staten Island was no longer just ferrying passengers. He was building the foundation of an empire, one trip at a time. And soon, the harbour would prove too small to hold him. The dawn light spilled over the New York harbour, gilding the water in molten gold. It was here, among the tangled masts and curling smoke from steamboats, that Cornelius Vanderbilt began to outgrow the world of small sails and simple ferry runs. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had already built a reputation along the waterfront, a man who could move goods and passengers faster and more reliably than almost anyone else. But speed alone was not enough. Cornelius understood something other captains didn't. The future of water transport was no longer in wind and tide. It was in steam. The new steamboats, hulking and loud, could cut journey times dramatically and run on a schedule that didn't depend on favorable winds. They were expensive to build and risky to operate. But for a man who had already made a career out of taking risks, they were the obvious next step. His chance came in 1817. Entrepreneur Thomas Gibbons, engaged in a bitter struggle against a rival ferry monopoly in New York Harbor, needed a captain he could trust to run his steamboat between New Jersey and Manhattan. Cornelius was the perfect choice. Young, fearless, and already known for his aggressive business style. The job was more than just steering a boat. Gibbons was waging an all-out war against the Ogden family, who held a state-granted monopoly on steamboat traffic in the harbor. To break it, Gibbons would have to challenge the monopoly in court. Vanderbilt wasn't just the hired help. He became a critical player in this high-stakes battle. The case, Gibbons v. Ogden, went all the way to the US Supreme Court. In 1824, the justices ruled in Gibbons's favor, striking down the monopoly and establishing that interstate commerce was under federal, not state, control. It was a landmark decision that reshaped the economic future of the United States. For Vanderbilt, it was more than a legal victory. It was a personal education in the power of law, leverage, and positioning. He had seen firsthand how a monopoly could strangle competition and how breaking one could open the floodgates for profit. When Thomas Gibbons died in 1826, his son inherited the business but had little interest in running it. Vanderbilt, sensing his moment, bought into the steamboat trade for himself. He had learned every inch of the routes, every trick of scheduling, and every price point customers would tolerate. And now, he was ready to apply it for his own gain. From the beginning, Vanderbilt played hardball. He would cut ticket prices so low that competitors had to either match him and bleed money, or watch their passengers defect to his boats. Sometimes he'd run at a loss temporarily just to force rivals out of business. Once the competition was gone, he'd raise prices back to profitable levels. It was a strategy that would define his career. Win at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing profit in the short term. It worked. Within a few years, Vanderbilt was no longer just a skilled captain. He was a steamboat owner with growing roots and a reputation as a ruthless competitor. By his 30s, he was operating steam lines up and down the Hudson River, connecting New York to Albany and beyond. He wasn't yet one of the city's great tycoons, but in the bustling, cutthroat world of transportation, his name was becoming impossible to ignore. The more success he had, the more ambitious he became. The rivers of the Northeast were lucrative, but Vanderbilt's eyes were already drifting southward. The growing settlements along the eastern seaboard needed faster connections to the booming cities of the north. And beyond that lay even bigger opportunities, routes that spanned entire coasts and, eventually, whole oceans. The young man who once ferried passengers in a single small boat was now commanding a fleet, his eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. For Vanderbilt, the journey was no longer about surviving the next season. It was about dominance. Complete, unchallenged dominance. What he couldn't yet see was that this same hunger, this refusal to share the playing field, would one day echo through the Vanderbilt bloodline, shaping both its golden age and its downfall. By the 1840s, Cornelius Vanderbilt was no longer just a regional shipping figure. He was becoming a national presence. His Hudson River operations were highly profitable, but for a man with his appetite, local success was never enough. The United States itself was growing fast, and with every mile of frontier settled, the hunger for faster connections between east and west, north and south, grew stronger. The next great opportunity came not from within the country, but from beyond its borders. The world was about to be gripped by a fever, the California gold rush. In 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and by 1849, thousands of prospectors were pouring toward the west coast. But the journey overland was perilous and slow, and sailing around Cape Horn took months. There was a faster way, a shortcut through Central America. Ships could sail from New York to the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, unload passengers and cargo, then cross the narrow isthmus by river and overland before boarding another ship to California. It was quicker, cheaper, and safer than the alternatives, and Vanderbilt intended to control it. He launched the Accessory Transit Company, securing rights from the Nicaraguan government to use this route. For a brief time, it was a masterstroke. Ships filled to capacity, money pouring in from gold seekers and freight haulers alike. Vanderbilt steamers dominated both ends of the journey, and the overland passage through Nicaragua became a conveyor belt for fortune hunters. But as always, where there was profit, there was competition and conflict. Other powerful figures in the shipping industry, including the notorious Charles Morgan and Cornelius Garrison, conspired to push Vanderbilt out of his own company. They staged a boardroom coup while Vanderbilt was away in Europe, stripping him of control. Most men would have accepted the loss as a costly mistake. Vanderbilt was not most men. When news of the betrayal reached him, he sent a letter to his former partners with a single chilling promise. "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you." Vanderbilt launched competing steamship lines at cut-rate prices, slashing fares so low his rivals bled money just to stay in the game. He cultivated political allies in Central America to strip them of their route rights. Within 2 years, they were finished, bankrupt and humiliated. This episode cemented Vanderbilt's reputation as a man you could not cross without consequence. It also reinforced a principle he had already lived by for decades. In business, sentiment was weakness, and revenge was not only personal but profitable. The Nicaragua route had given Vanderbilt a taste of something even bigger: the possibility of a canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Long before the Panama Canal was built, he envisioned one cutting through Nicaragua, transforming global trade and putting its toll revenue directly into his hands. But the technology, capital, and political stability required for such a project were not yet in place. The dream would remain unfulfilled in his lifetime, but it revealed how far his thinking had shifted. He was no longer content to dominate one region or even one country. He was thinking in hemispheres. By the early 1850s, Vanderbilt had become synonymous with American shipping. His fleets connected New York to New Orleans, Havana, and San Francisco. His name appeared in newspapers from Boston to London, often accompanied by both admiration and outrage. To his supporters, he was the embodiment of American enterprise, a self-made man who had risen from nothing to command a fortune through ingenuity and grit. To his critics, he was a monopolist, a predator who crushed competition with the same cold efficiency as a ship's paddle wheel chopping through the wake. And yet, even with all his wealth and dominance, Vanderbilt's personal life remained stark. He dressed plainly, lived frugally compared to other tycoons, and seemed to take more satisfaction from winning than from spending. He had no interest in being a polished society gentleman. He preferred the role of the blunt, unstoppable Commodore. But a storm was coming, not from the seas, but from within his own country. The 1860s would bring the American Civil War, a conflict that would reshape the nation's economy and transportation systems. And Vanderbilt, ever the opportunist, would find ways to make the war serve his ambitions. The man who once ferried passengers across a narrow strip of water was now moving armies, gold, and goods across continents. And yet, as powerful as he had become, this was only the halfway point of his rise. The next phase would take him off the water entirely, and onto the rails. By the time the American Civil War erupted in 1861, Cornelius Vanderbilt was already one of the most formidable shipping magnates in the country. He had fleets that could carry thousands of passengers, haul goods between hemispheres, and outcompete nearly any rival. But war has a way of rearranging the economy, and in wartime, ships were no longer just for commerce. They could be weapons. Vanderbilt saw an opening. In 1862, he made a move that shocked even his fiercest competitors. He donated his largest and most advanced steamship, the Vanderbilt, to the Union Navy. It was an act that seemed almost philanthropic, but it was anything but pure charity. The gesture earned him national acclaim, bolstered his political connections in Washington, and, perhaps most importantly, positioned him to benefit from the post-war transportation. When the war ended in 1865, America's transportation needs were changing. The rivers and coasts still mattered, but the true arteries of the future were iron. Railroads that could link the country from city to city without a single change of ship or wagon. The men who controlled them would control commerce itself. Most shipping men saw railroads as a threat. Vanderbilt saw them as an evolution and an invitation. In 1863, he began buying into the New York and Harlem Railroad, a small, struggling line that ran north out of Manhattan. The move baffled Wall Street. The Harlem line was considered a losing proposition, noisy and dangerous, with its tracks running right down the middle of 4th Avenue. It had no glamour, no promise. But Vanderbilt saw something others didn't: location. The Harlem line was Manhattan's only passenger train into the city's core, and in the right hands, it could be the foundation of a far larger network. His takeover of Harlem was not gentle. Vanderbilt bought aggressively, squeezing out other investors and solidifying his position as majority shareholder. Once in control, he began a transformation. He hired engineers to depress the tracks below street level, covering them so that the road above could be developed. 4th Avenue, once a hazardous corridor of steam and steel, became a prestigious boulevard, Park Avenue. But Harlem was just the start. In quick succession, Vanderbilt acquired the Hudson River Railroad and then the crown jewel of Northeastern Rail, the New York Central Railroad. The New York Central was a vital link between Manhattan and the growing industrial hubs of the Midwest. By merging it with his other holdings, Vanderbilt created a single, streamlined network that moved passengers and freight with unprecedented speed and efficiency. It was empire building on land, and Vanderbilt applied the same ruthless strategies that had served him at sea. He undercut competitors' freight rates until they either sold out or went bankrupt. He consolidated routes to eliminate waste, upgraded tracks and rolling stock, and instituted schedules that made the New York Central the most reliable line in the region. His crowning achievement came in 1871, the construction of Grand Central Depot at 42nd Street. Until then, New York's train lines had terminated in chaotic, scattered stations. Vanderbilt envisioned a single, monumental terminal where all his lines could converge, funneling the city's passengers through one controlled point: his point. Grand Central Depot was a marvel for its time, vast, orderly, and symbolic of Vanderbilt's dominance. It wasn't just a building, it was a declaration. From this station, Vanderbilt's trains reached Boston, Chicago, and countless cities in between. The man who had once ferried passengers across a harbor now moved the very lifeblood of the nation. People, goods, raw materials across thousands of miles of steel. Yet even in his triumph, Vanderbilt's personality remained unchanged. He still dressed plainly, spoke bluntly, and seemed to take more joy in the game of outmaneuvering rivals than in any display of wealth. But his personal life was far from calm. His first wife, Sophia Johnson, had died in 1868 after more than 50 years of marriage, a marriage marked as much by his infidelities and harsh treatment as by any partnership. The following year, at 75, Vanderbilt married his 30-year-old cousin, Frank Armstrong Crawford, a former Confederate and devout Methodist who would soon influence one of his few philanthropic acts: a $1 million endowment to found Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. By the mid-1870s, Vanderbilt's railroad empire was unmatched. His fortune was estimated at $100 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era. He had outlived most of his rivals, buried several of his children, and outpaced nearly every other businessman of his generation. But the Commodore was aging. His health was failing, and although he had named his son William Henry Billy Vanderbilt as his heir, there were whispers, some from Vanderbilt himself, that Billy was a blockhead, unfit to run the empire. The stage was set for one final act in the Commodore's life: the transfer of his fortune, the cementing of his legacy, and the first fractures in the dynasty he had built from saltwater and steel. By the mid-1870s, Cornelius, the Commodore, Vanderbilt had achieved what no other American businessman of his generation could claim: dominance over both the waterways and the railroads. His name was a synonym for power, and yet, within the marble halls of his home and the smoky corridors of Wall Street, the question everyone whispered was the same: what happens when the Commodore is gone? At 82 years old, Vanderbilt's health was failing. He had been ill for months, his once imposing figure now shrunken, though his mind remained sharp enough to issue orders and approve deals. He still rose early, still read reports, still met with his top executives. But the empire was running on momentum, and he knew it. The question of succession could no longer be ignored. Vanderbilt had 13 children, but he had no intention of dividing his fortune evenly. His philosophy had always been that consolidation of power was essential. In business, splitting control invited weakness. In family, it was no different. From early on, he had decided that his chosen heir would be his eldest surviving son, William Henry Billy Vanderbilt, despite a long-standing belief, voiced bluntly to anyone who asked, that Billy was a blockhead. The choice was pragmatic. Billy had shown a measure of competence running some of the family's rail lines, and more importantly, Vanderbilt believed that keeping the fortune in one pair of hands was the only way to preserve it. But the other children knew what was coming, and resentment simmered just beneath the surface. In the final months of his life, the Commodore's second wife, Frank Armstrong Crawford Vanderbilt, remained by his side. A pious Methodist and former Confederate loyalist, Frank had already persuaded him to donate $1 million, the largest charitable gift in American history at the time, to establish Vanderbilt University in Nashville. It was one of the few philanthropic acts he ever made, and it would stand as a lasting monument to her influence. The end came on January 4, 1877. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in his Manhattan brownstone at 10 Washington Place, surrounded by family. His fortune at death was estimated at $100 million, equivalent to over $3 billion today. Then came the will. As expected, the bulk of the estate, a staggering 95%, went to Billy. The remaining children were given comparatively small sums, and the reaction was immediate. Outrage turned to legal action. Several of his children, led by his son Cornelius Jeremiah, a troubled figure with a history of gambling and mental illness, sued to break the will. In the midst of the inheritance drama, an odd episode took place, one that would become part of Vanderbilt family law. Billy, perhaps eager to strengthen his claim, enlisted the services of a spiritualist medium. During a séance, the medium claimed to contact the spirit of Sophia Johnson, the Commodore's first wife. Sophia's message from beyond the grave was simple: all of Cornelius's money should go to Billy. Whether the episode was a calculated stunt or a genuine attempt to appeal to sentiment is unclear, but it became yet another layer in the Vanderbilt saga. Equal parts legal battle and high society theatre. In the end, the challengers settled, accepting modest increases in their inheritances. Billy retained control of the empire, and the responsibility for proving that he was not the blockhead his father had once called him. Billy would do more than that. In less than a decade, he would double the family fortune, expand the railroad empire, and thrust the Vanderbilts into an era of opulence that would eclipse even the Commodore's showpieces. But in doing so, he would also plant the seeds of the excess, rivalries, and carelessness that would eventually destroy the dynasty's financial foundation. For all his cunning, Cornelius Vanderbilt could not foresee how quickly the tides would turn after his death. He had built an empire with the ruthless precision of a general, but he had built it around himself. Without the Commodore at the helm, the Vanderbilt fortune was a vast, gleaming ship sailing into waters that would soon prove treacherous. And as Billy Vanderbilt stepped aboard as captain, the world, and the family, prepared to see whether he could keep it afloat. The great marble mausoleum on Staten Island was barely sealed before William Henry Billy Vanderbilt found himself at the center of the most closely watched succession in America. For years, whispers had trailed him, that his father thought him weak, that he lacked the steel to command an empire, that he was a caretaker, not a builder. In truth, Billy had heard the word blockhead from the Commodore's lips more than once. Now, with $95 million in his control, more than any single person in the country had ever held, he was determined to silence the doubters. Billy's first moves were practical, almost shockingly so. He streamlined management, installed trusted lieutenants, and tightened cost controls across the sprawling railroad network. The Commodore had left him a machine built for dominance, but like any machine, it required maintenance, and Billy had no intention of letting rust creep in. His instincts proved sharper than many expected. Within just 8 years, he had doubled the family fortune, growing it to nearly $200 million, an achievement that even his father, with all his ruthlessness, had never matched in so short a time. Yet while Billy was consolidating power in the boardroom, he was also transforming the Vanderbilt name into something grander and far more visible. The Commodore had lived relatively modestly compared to his wealth, dressing plainly and keeping his personal life relatively unadorned. Billy had no such restraint. If the Gilded Age was a stage, Billy was stepping into the spotlight. The Triple Palace on Fifth Avenue became his signature creation, a sprawling, fortress-like residence that was actually 3 interconnected mansions, one for Billy and his wife Maria, and one each for his daughters, Emily and Margaret. From the outside, it was an unapologetic wall of brownstone, imposing and monumental. Inside, it was a theatre of excess, rooms dripping with gilded mouldings, walls hung with old master paintings, and dining halls lit by glittering chandeliers imported from Europe. The Triple Palace was more than a home. It was a statement that the Vanderbilts were not merely rich, but the pinnacle of American society, equal to or above the oldest money in New York. But old money did not always welcome new kings. Families like the Astors had long held sway over New York's social hierarchy, and they viewed the Vanderbilts as upstarts, industrial men, builders of railroads and steamships, lacking the genteel lineage that the city's elite prized. Billy's answer was simple. If the old guard wouldn't open the door, he'd build a better one. The Vanderbilts began hosting lavish balls that rivaled anything in Europe. Entire ballrooms were transformed into indoor gardens, hung with orchids and lit with thousands of candles. Guest lists were carefully curated to include foreign nobility, powerful industrialists, and the occasional artist or writer to give the events an air of cultivated taste. It was during this period that Billy made the remark that would cement his reputation as a man who cared little for public opinion. When a journalist asked whether a particular railway expansion was meant for the public good, Billy replied bluntly, "The public be damned. I'm working for my stockholders." The quote spread like wildfire. Critics painted him as arrogant and indifferent to ordinary Americans. But in the private clubs and boardrooms where power truly resided, the remark was seen as refreshingly honest. Billy was not a politician. He was a businessman, and businessmen did not build empires by pretending otherwise. His personal life, however, was far warmer than the Commodore's had been. Billy was devoted to his wife, Maria Louisa Kissam, a minister's daughter whose refinement softened his public image. Together, they raised 9 children, many of whom would go on to play prominent roles in the next chapter of the Vanderbilt saga, some as empire builders, others as cautionary tales. Still, for all his efficiency in business and warmth at home, Billy had one weakness, a taste for display. The Commodore's pride had been in winning. Billy's was in showing that he had won. Every mansion, every painting, every gala was proof that he had taken the Vanderbilt fortune not only further than his father had imagined, but into a realm where wealth itself became a kind of performance art. And as we'll see, in the Gilded Age, performance was everything. The Triple Palace on Fifth Avenue did not just dominate the street physically, it dominated conversation. In a city where architecture was a language of power, Billy Vanderbilt's home spoke in the booming, unapologetic tones of a man who wanted no one to doubt his rank. Inside, the opulence bordered on the theatrical. The entrance hall was designed to overwhelm, marble floors gleaming under crystal chandeliers, walls panelled in rare woods imported from across the Atlantic, and staircases that curved upward like something from a palace on the Loire. Servants in liveried uniforms moved silently from room to room, making the service seem effortless even in the midst of chaos. And there was chaos, the carefully orchestrated chaos of Vanderbilt balls. These were not mere gatherings. They were spectacles designed to shift the gravitational pull of New York society away from the Astors and toward the Vanderbilts. It was a challenge to the old guard, and the woman leading the charge was not Billy himself, but Alva Smith Vanderbilt, the wife of his son William Kissam Vanderbilt. Alva was determined that the Vanderbilts would not be excluded from the so-called 400, the tightly curated list of New York's social elite maintained by Caroline Astor. If Mrs. Astor would not extend an invitation, then Alva would create an event so dazzling that even the Queen of Society could not ignore it. The result was the 1883 Vanderbilt Ball, a housewarming for William and Alva's new Fifth Avenue chateau. Costing an estimated $250,000 more than $7 million today, the ball was a fantasy brought to life. Guests arrived in elaborate costumes, medieval queens, Roman senators, mythical deities, each outfit designed to outshine the last. The chandeliers sparkled over tables groaning with delicacies from Paris, while orchestras filled the vast rooms with music. But the real coup came in the invitations. None were sent to Mrs. Astor's daughter. The slight was deliberate. If Mrs. Astor wanted her daughter to attend the most talked about event of the decade, she would have to formally acknowledge the Vanderbilts as part of her circle. She did. And with that, the Vanderbilts stormed the gates of high society. Billy's fortune, and his willingness to spend it, had bought the family entry into the old money sanctum. But that same willingness to spend was about to reshape the Vanderbilt legacy in ways the Commodore would never have imagined. The focus was shifting from business to display. While Billy still ran the railroads with a steady hand, more and more of the Vanderbilt energy and capital went into real estate and social dominance. The family commissioned architects to build sprawling summer cottages in Newport, each one more extravagant than the last. These were no cottages in the conventional sense. They were palaces overlooking the sea, modeled after French chateaux and Italian Renaissance villas, fitted with marble imported from Carrara and tapestries woven in Paris. Among the most famous was the Breakers, later built by Billy's son Cornelius Vanderbilt Stassing. It would become a symbol of the Gilded Age itself. 70 rooms of marble, mosaics, and gilded ceilings with a staff to match. The Breakers was not just a home, it was a stage on which the Vanderbilts could present themselves as America's answer to European nobility. Yet beneath all the grandeur, a subtle shift was happening. The Commodore's empire had been built on ruthless efficiency and expansion. Billy's era was about consolidation, not just of the business, but of image, prestige, and alliances. It worked in the short term. The Vanderbilts were no longer the upstarts from Staten Island. They were the standard against which all other American fortunes were measured. Still, in chasing social dominance, the family had begun to treat wealth as an end rather than a means. The massive expenditures on balls, mansions, and art collections made them legends, but they also tied the Vanderbilt name to a lifestyle that required constant, extravagant upkeep. Billy seemed unconcerned. To him, the proof of his success was all around. The bustling rail lines under his control, the deference of Wall Street, the begrudging respect of the Astors, and the sight of his children marrying into both American and European aristocracy. The Vanderbilts had not only risen higher than kings, they were marrying into their ranks. It was the zenith of the dynasty. And, as history always teaches, zeniths are followed by decline. By the late 1880s, William Henry Billy Vanderbilt was a man who had nothing left to prove. In the space of a single decade, he had silenced his critics, doubled the family fortune, and transformed the Vanderbilt name from that of a business empire into a cultural dynasty. His railroads spanned the Northeast and beyond. His homes were monuments to the Gilded Age, and his children were seated at the very heart of New York society. But with the satisfaction came a change in pace. Billy, unlike his father, had never derived endless pleasure from the grind of business. He had proven himself capable, and now he seemed content to focus on the fruits of that success rather than the relentless expansion that had consumed the Commodore. He began withdrawing from day-to-day railroad operations, delegating more power to trusted executives and, increasingly, to his sons. The Vanderbilt empire was no longer the story of one man's willpower. It was a machine, and Billy expected it to run smoothly whether he was at the controls or not. Still, he remained deeply involved in certain projects, particularly in real estate and philanthropy. Like many Gilded Age titans, Billy believed in grand gestures, endowments to cultural institutions, contributions to churches, and the construction of public works that bore the family name. He had watched his father donate to found Vanderbilt University, and he continued the tradition of philanthropy, though always with an eye toward prestige as well as public good. Yet even as he cemented the family's place in the social order, Billy could not escape the realities of time. His health began to fail in the late 1880s, the result of years of stress and the sheer physical strain of running and defending one of the largest fortunes in the world. Friends and associates noted that he seemed more reflective, more willing to speak of legacy than of expansion. He spent his final years surrounded by family, often at his sprawling summer estates, where the ocean breeze and the glitter of Newport's social season offered a gentler pace than the clatter of Wall Street or the smoke of the rail yards. Billy Vanderbilt died on December 8, 1885, at the age of 64. The official cause was a stroke, though many said he had simply worn himself out. A man who had sprinted to prove himself, reached the summit, and then found no higher peak to climb. His death triggered yet another major transfer of wealth within the family. The 200 million fortune, an amount staggering even by today's standards, passed primarily to his two eldest sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt II and William Kissam Vanderbilt. It was a calculated division. Cornelius II, the more business-minded, would take control of the New York Central Railroad and the day-to-day operations of the Vanderbilt transport empire. William Kissam, whose interests leaned more toward culture and society, would inherit vast real estate holdings and the freedom to pursue the social conquests that his wife Alva had already begun with such ferocity. The handoff marked a subtle but profound shift in the nature of Vanderbilt power. Under the Commodore, the fortune had been built by sheer entrepreneurial force. Under Billy, it had been consolidated and legitimized, grafted firmly onto the trunk of America's social elite. Now, under the next generation, it would become something else entirely, a tool for display, a ticket into the rarefied world of European aristocracy and, increasingly, a source of rivalry between branches of the family. At Billy's funeral, the pews were filled with a cross-section of America's ruling class, industrialists, politicians, bankers, and socialites, all gathered to pay respects not just to a man, but to the embodiment of the Gilded Age's intoxicating blend of money, ambition, and spectacle. The Commodore had built the machine. Billy had polished it until it gleamed. Now, the question was, would the next generation know how to keep it running? The torch passed to Cornelius Vanderbilt II with the weight of both expectation and spectacle. As Billy's eldest son, Cornelius, was now the public face of the Vanderbilt empire, the man who would sit at the head of the boardroom table of the New York Central Railroad and preside over the family's sprawling fortune. He had grown up under the shadow of two titans, his grandfather, the iron-willed Commodore, and his father, the shrewd and surprisingly successful blockhead who had doubled the family wealth. If Cornelius felt the pressure, he did not show it. From the moment he assumed control, he presented himself as a man entirely at ease with power. Cornelius was not just a businessman, he was a society man. His marriage to Alice Claypool Gwynn, a refined and socially astute Sunday school teacher from a well-connected old New York family, had cemented his position not only in the world of finance, but in the rarefied circles of Manhattan's elite. Alice brought with her a natural grace, an instinct for diplomacy, and, as the years would prove, a talent for using architecture, art, and fashion to project the Vanderbilt name into the realm of legend. In the 1880s, the Vanderbilts were already well established in Newport, Rhode Island, the seaside enclave where America's richest families built their summer cottages. But the Vanderbilt properties were about to reach an entirely new level of extravagance. The crown jewel would be the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance-style palazzo overlooking the Atlantic. It was not merely a home, it was a statement of dominance, designed to outshine even the most elaborate residences of the Astors or Morgans. Inside, imported marble, gilded ceilings, and intricate mosaics created an atmosphere that could rival any palace in Europe. The dining room was large enough to host banquets for dozens. The ballroom was a cavern of light and music, where guests danced beneath chandeliers that sparkled like constellations. Cornelius and Alice knew how to use the Breakers. It was not simply a retreat from the city, it was a stage. Summer seasons in Newport were an endless cycle of luncheons, sailing regattas, and grand balls. Each event an opportunity to reinforce the Vanderbilt image as America's answer to aristocracy. But for all the elegance, there was also a streak of audacity. At the famous 1883 ball thrown by Cornelius's sister-in-law Alva, Alice had appeared in a gown that became legend, yellow satin embroidered with crystal lightning bolts, powered by a hidden battery pack that lit a real electric light bulb she held aloft. Electricity was still a novelty, and in that moment, Alice was not just wearing a dress. She was declaring that the Vanderbilts stood at the cutting edge of wealth and modernity. In business, Cornelius was competent, though less aggressive than his father or grandfather. He managed the railroads with a steady hand, expanding where opportunity demanded, but rarely engaging in the kind of cutthroat battles that had defined the Commodore's era. His real passion seemed to lie in the life his wealth allowed him to lead, a life of refined leisure, patronage of the arts, and architectural legacy. It was a golden time for the Vanderbilts. The family's name appeared constantly in the society pages, their homes described in breathless detail, their parties treated as newsworthy events. They were courted by European nobility, their daughters sought after by dukes and princes looking to replenish fortunes with American dollars. Yet even in these glittering years, the first hairline cracks were beginning to form. The money was still vast, but the focus was shifting further from its source, the railroads and investments, to the lifestyle it supported. For the younger Vanderbilts coming of age in the 1890s, wealth was not something to be built. It was something to be inherited, enjoyed, and, too often, displayed. Cornelius himself seemed immune to such carelessness, but the seeds of overindulgence had been planted. The Gilded Age was, after all, a time when showing wealth was as important as having it. And in that arena, the Vanderbilts were undisputed champions. If Cornelius Vanderbilt II represented the poised and socially secure face of the dynasty, his younger brother Cornelius Neely Vanderbilt III was its rebel. Born into unimaginable privilege, Neely had been groomed for a life of service to the family's empire. He attended Yale, studied engineering, and by all appearances was destined for a respectable and profitable career within the Vanderbilt structure. Then came Grace Graham Wilson. Grace was the daughter of a prominent New York banker, well-bred, intelligent, and vivacious. But for reasons still debated in society columns decades later, Cornelius II did not approve of her as a match for his son. Perhaps it was her family's lesser fortune, perhaps a personal clash, or perhaps the simple fact that Vanderbilt patriarchs liked to dictate the terms of their heirs' marriages. Neely, however, had inherited the Vanderbilt stubbornness. In 1896, defying his father's explicit wishes, he and Grace eloped. It was an act that sent shockwaves through the family and the press alike. Cornelius II's response was swift and cold. Neely was cut out of his father's will, losing what would have been a vast inheritance. But the elopement was not the end of Neely's story. In some ways, it was the beginning of the life he truly wanted. Far from ruined, he received a settlement of $500,000, a fortune in its own right, and set about building a career outside the shadow of the family empire. Drawing on his engineering background, Neely developed and patented numerous innovations for railroad travel, including improved braking systems and more efficient couplers. Ironically, these inventions benefited the very industry his father had wanted him to help manage directly. Neely also threw himself into public service. He served 17 years in the National Guard, eventually achieving the rank of Brigadier General during World War I. Stationed in France, he commanded troops with a level of discipline and competence that earned him respect among his peers and subordinates alike. In his private life, Neely embraced a cosmopolitan lifestyle. He and Grace became fixtures in European high society, cultivating friendships with the likes of King Edward VII of Britain and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Yachting through the Mediterranean, attending royal functions, and entertaining dignitaries aboard their lavish vessels, they lived a life that blended American wealth with European glamour. When his uncle George Vanderbilt died, Neely inherited the Triple Palace on Fifth Avenue. Rather than leaving it as a relic of a bygone era, he modernized it, updating its interiors to suit the tastes of the 20th century, while still retaining the grandeur that symbolized the Vanderbilt name. Yet for all his accomplishments, Neely's relationship with the rest of the family remained complicated. His elopement had set a precedent. A Vanderbilt could defy the family's rigid expectations and still thrive, at least if they had the skills, charm, and connections to back it up. For some in the next generation, this was inspiring. For others, it was a dangerous lesson in the belief that fortune was indestructible. By the 1920s, Neely and Grace had settled into an established pattern. Winters in New York, summers abroad, their names still appearing in the society pages, though now with less of the scandal that had once surrounded them. They had proven that a Vanderbilt could live outside the empire and still command attention. It was, in many ways, a symbol of how the family itself was changing. No longer a single, unified force under one patriarch, the Vanderbilts were becoming a constellation of powerful, wealthy individuals, each orbiting the family legacy at their own distance, some close, others far, and all burning their own fuel at different rates. And as Neely's story showed, that independence could be both a mark of resilience and the first quiet step toward fragmentation. If Neely Vanderbilt proved that a son could break away from the family empire and still flourish, his son Cornelius Vanderbilt IV proved that one could break away entirely, from the business, from the money, and even from the life of idle privilege. Cornelius IV was born in 1898 into a world gilded from the cradle. His early years were spent between the Triple Palace in New York and summers at Newport, surrounded by servants, fine tutors, and the unspoken understanding that a Vanderbilt's life followed certain rules. He hated those rules. While many of his cousins were content to drift into society life or take nominal positions in finance and railroads, Cornelius IV had an itch for movement. At just 17, he left school to join the US Army during World War I, serving as an ambulance driver in France. The trenches and battlefields were a world apart from the polished marble floors of Fifth Avenue, and they left their mark on him. Returning to America, Cornelius IV enrolled at Yale, but lasted only briefly before leaving to pursue journalism. This was no vanity project. He worked as a reporter for the New York Herald, covering crime, politics, and human interest stories with the energy of someone desperate to understand the wider world. But his most famous and notorious move came in 1927, when he published his memoir, Farewell to Fifth Avenue. The book was an unflinching portrait of the excess and emptiness of Gilded Age society, pulling back the curtain on the Vanderbilts and their peers. It was part confession, part indictment, and wholly scandalous. Family members were furious, society friends cut ties, and Cornelius IV found himself persona non grata in the same drawing rooms where he'd once been a fixture. He didn't seem to mind. Instead, he leaned into a career that took him far from New York's polite circles. He became a globe-trotting journalist, covering conflicts and political upheavals across Europe and Asia. In the 1930s, he reported from the Spanish Civil War, interviewing revolutionaries and generals alike. During World War II, he served as a war correspondent in North Africa, dodging shellfire to bring home stories of soldiers on the front lines. This was not a life without cost. Cornelius IV married 7 times, each union ending in divorce. The press, always eager to report on Vanderbilt drama, chronicled his personal life with as much interest as his professional exploits. To some, he was a romantic adventurer. To others, a cautionary tale of a man running from the weight of his name. Financially, he was no longer in the league of his forebears. While he inherited some money, much of it was spent or lost through his restless ventures. By midlife, Cornelius IV was working steadily as a freelance journalist, supplementing his income with public speaking and the occasional book deal. And yet, in his own way, he had preserved something rare among Vanderbilts. Long after the era of private railcars and Newport balls had faded, Cornelius IV was still in the headlines, not for inherited grandeur, but for his own deeds. He had traded marble halls for press tents, silk waistcoats for dusty field jackets, and polite applause for the satisfaction of surviving on his own terms. In doing so, he became one of the last Vanderbilts to live a life that captured the public imagination. But if Cornelius IV's journey proved that the Vanderbilt name could still carry weight outside the realms of finance and society, it also underscored a growing truth. The dynasty's fortune and cohesion were dissolving, replaced by scattered lives, each burning through their inheritance at different speeds. And as the 20th century advanced, the question was no longer how high a Vanderbilt could rise, but how far they might fall before the name was just another echo from the Gilded Age. By the mid-20th century, the Vanderbilt name still glittered in the headlines, but its power came less from railroads and boardrooms, and more from runway shows, glossy magazines, and society pages. This was the era when fashion, art, and celebrity replaced industry as the family's public stage. And while the grandeur was intoxicating, the spending, without the colossal income of the railroad years, was catastrophic. Among the brightest of this new generation was Gloria Vanderbilt, perhaps the most famous Vanderbilt of the modern age. Born in 1924, she became a household name not for business achievements, but for her dramatic childhood custody battle, dubbed the Trial of the Century in 1934. At just 10 years old, her life was splashed across every newspaper as her mother and aunt fought bitterly for control of her fortune. The trial revealed sordid details of family feuds, financial mismanagement, and the fragility behind the glittering facade. The public couldn't look away. As an adult, Gloria carved out her own place in history. She became a celebrated artist, model, and actress, later transforming herself into a fashion entrepreneur with her wildly popular line of designer jeans in the 1970s and 1980s. For a moment, her name became synonymous, not with old money, but with sleek, aspirational style. Yet even at the height of her commercial success, Gloria was candid about the instability of her finances. The family's old fortune was gone. What remained had to be earned, and often spent as quickly as it was made. The Vanderbilts of the mid-century lived in a way their railroad-building ancestors might not have understood or approved of. They mingled with movie stars and artists instead of captains of industry, vacationed in Europe instead of overseeing vast business operations, and became subjects of wealth rather than managers of it. They were still fixtures in the social scene. Charity galas, art exhibitions, and fashion events were their new boardrooms. But behind the scenes, many branches of the family were quietly selling off properties, liquidating assets, or living on dwindling trust funds. The Gilded Age palaces that once defined the Vanderbilt mythos were rapidly disappearing. By the 1950s and 1960s, most of the grand Fifth Avenue mansions had been demolished, replaced by high-rises and office towers. In Newport, many of the summer cottages were sold to preservation societies, museums, or wealthy outsiders. These sales were often bittersweet affairs, covered in the press with an air of mourning. It was as though each demolition, each auction of silver and artwork, was another nail in the coffin of the family's empire. Perhaps the most striking change in this era was that the Vanderbilts still had status, but without the financial clout to back it up. They could attend the same glamorous parties as the Rockefellers or Kennedys, but they no longer controlled the industries that shaped America. Some family members embraced this reality, living quietly and working regular jobs far from the glare of publicity. Others tried to keep up appearances, overspending in a bid to project an image of wealth that no longer matched their bank accounts. By the close of the 20th century, the once unthinkable had become reality. The Vanderbilt fortune, built by Cornelius and multiplied by his heirs in the 19th century, had evaporated. The America's royal family moniker still appeared in nostalgic features, but it now referred to a bygone era. The last vestiges of the Gilded Age grandeur were preserved in photographs, memoirs, and the carefully maintained estates that had been turned into tourist attractions. Visitors could tour the breakers in Newport or Biltmore in North Carolina, marveling at the opulence and wondering how such wealth could vanish in just a few generations. By this point, the Dynasties' story was no longer about how to get rich, but about how to stay rich, and how easily even a fortune that once rivaled kings could slip away when scattered across heirs, diluted by extravagance and disconnected from the industries that sustained it. The Vanderbilts had entered the history books not just as a symbol of America's rise, but as a warning about its excesses. And soon, the final chapters of their story would be written, not in the grandeur of the Gilded Age, but in the shadow of what had been lost. By the dawn of the 20th century's second half, the Vanderbilts were no longer captains of industry. They were passengers in a rapidly changing America. Their story had shifted from one of accumulating wealth to one of losing it, piece by piece, in a slow, almost operatic unraveling. And like all great tragedies, the fall wasn't sudden. It was gradual, a chain of decisions, cultural changes, and economic realities that, combined, bled the fortune dry. From the very beginning, the Vanderbilt fortune was destined to be divided. Cornelius, the Commodore, had left the bulk of his empire to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who famously doubled the fortune. But when William died, the split began. Instead of consolidating wealth in one heir, his estate was distributed among 8 children. Each inherited an immense sum, but it was now a fraction of the whole. By the time their estates passed to the next generation, the money was split again. Within just 3 or 4 cycles of inheritance, fortunes that had once been in the hundreds of millions in today's dollars, tens of billions, were diluted to mere millions or even hundreds of thousands. That kind of wealth could still buy luxury, but not the kind of industrial dominance the Vanderbilts had once enjoyed. The Vanderbilts weren't just rich, they lived rich, in ways that were unsustainable without constant replenishment. Maintaining multiple enormous estates like the Breakers, Marble House, and Biltmore wasn't a matter of a few $1,000s a year. These properties required armies of staff, constant repairs, imported furnishings, and vast gardens. In some cases, upkeep costs could exceed $1 million annually in today's money, per property. When the railroad money was flowing, this was manageable. But once those assets were sold or their profits diminished, the estates became anchors pulling the family's finances under. By the early 20th century, another factor had appeared that the Commodore never faced: the US income tax, introduced in 1913. Even more devastating was the estate tax, which took large bites out of fortunes every time they passed to the next generation. When William K. Vanderbilt died in 1920, his estate was hit hard by these taxes. Suddenly, heirs weren't just inheriting less because of family division. They were inheriting less because the government was taking a significant portion off the top. Many were forced to sell land, art, and mansions just to cover the tax bill. The Vanderbilts' fortune was built on railroads, but railroads were no longer the future. By the 1930s, automobiles, highways, and airplanes had begun to cut into passenger travel. Trucking and pipelines started replacing rail for certain goods. Even for the freight business, competition was fierce, and regulation tightened profit margins. By the mid-20th century, the New York Central Railroad, once the crown jewel of the Vanderbilt Empire, was struggling. In 1968, it merged with its old rival, the Pennsylvania Railroad, in a desperate bid for survival. The merger was a disaster, and just 2 years later, the new company filed for bankruptcy. History at the time. For a family whose identity was tied to the rails, this was more than just a financial blow. It was the symbolic death of the empire. Another quiet but profound factor in the Vanderbilt decline was cultural. The Gilded Age ethos, that wealth should be displayed, gave way in the 20th century to more understated ideals among the upper class. Many younger Vanderbilts didn't want to live in drafty 70-room mansions or host 250,000 balls, in modern terms, 6-7 million events, just to impress society. Some sought careers in the arts, journalism, or academia, admirable pursuits, but not empire-building ones. The family no longer produced industrial titans. Without new sources of massive income, the wealth that remained could only go one way, down. The decline was most visible in the sale of the family's iconic properties. 1914, Frederick Vanderbilt's Hyde Park estate was sold. 1925, Alva Vanderbilt sold Marble House. 1947, William K. Vanderbilt's Idlehour estate was auctioned. 1951, the magnificent Fifth Avenue mansions were demolished. 1972, the Breakers was sold to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $365,000, a fraction of its original construction cost. 1995, even Gloria Vanderbilt's Manhattan apartment, filled with art and heirlooms, was put on the market. Every sale was framed as practical or necessary, but taken together, they were the visible dismantling of the Vanderbilt legacy. If taxes, inheritance, and shifting industries were the slow-acting poisons, the Vanderbilts also drank their share of faster ones. Public scandals, bitter divorces, and bad business ventures that shredded reputations and bank balances alike. The Gilded Age had trained them to live in the headlines, but in the 20th century, this visibility was less an asset and more a vulnerability. The public no longer idolized extreme wealth without question. Instead, there was growing skepticism, even hostility toward old money that appeared to do little but spend. The Vanderbilts had once married strategically, binding themselves to European nobility or other wealthy American dynasties. In theory, this preserved social standing. In practice, it often drained money and emotional stability. Take Consuelo Vanderbilt, forced by her mother, Alva, into marrying the Duke of Marlborough. The union was a cold, transactional affair designed to give the Duke an American fortune and Consuelo a British title. It ended in divorce, after which Consuelo donated much of her settlement to charity. Admirable, but further reducing the family's consolidated wealth. This pattern repeated. Multiple Vanderbilts married into aristocracy, only to face costly divorces, settlements, and the loss of property as part of separation agreements. Earlier, Vanderbilts at least invested in railroads, steamships, and industry. By the mid-20th century, many heirs had no interest in such ventures. Instead, they sank funds into hobbies, personal indulgences, or underperforming business ideas. One branch of the family tried to sustain horse racing stables that hemorrhaged money. Another pursued yacht racing at an Olympic level, a sport that, while glamorous, consumed small fortunes in maintenance and competition costs without producing a financial return. Some entered Hollywood circles, funding films or shows that flopped. Others became patrons of avant-garde art movements that, while culturally significant, were not financially lucrative. By the 1950s and 60s, Vanderbilt had shifted from being the name of titans to being a marketable brand in itself. Family members licensed it to everything from fashion lines to household products. The most famous example was Gloria Vanderbilt, who leveraged her name into a wildly successful line of designer jeans in the 1970s. For a brief moment, she resurrected the Vanderbilt fortune, but even her success couldn't reverse the long-term trend. Licensing and fashion income could not match the scale of a lost industrial empire. Gloria's own life was a testament to the contradictions of the modern Vanderbilts. She was creative, resourceful, and media-savvy, but also endured financial betrayals, lawsuits, and the pressures of constant public scrutiny. In the 19th century, opulence was seen as the rightful expression of success. By the mid-20th century, however, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the rise of the middle class had altered America's values. Ostentatious displays of wealth were now seen as tone-deaf, even immoral, in an era where the country had endured breadlines and rationing. The Vanderbilts' palatial estates, once admired, began to feel like relics of an embarrassing past, costly, impractical, and increasingly difficult to justify. Many heirs opted to quietly liquidate properties, move into more modest homes, and blend into a more understated upper-middle-class lifestyle. The sheer size of the Vanderbilt family also worked against them. By the 4th generation, there were dozens of direct heirs and even more indirect beneficiaries. Each had different ambitions, obligations, and financial habits. There was no central authority, no Commodore, no William Henry, to reinvest profits or guard against waste. The family never created a lasting trust or holding company to preserve its wealth across generations. Each branch was essentially on its own, and some fared better than others. Those who had the discipline to invest wisely and live modestly retained personal fortunes, but many others saw their inheritances evaporate within a decade or two. From the 1940s onward, Vanderbilt auctions became events in themselves, bittersweet spectacles where the public could bid on the trappings of one of America's greatest fortunes. Artworks, silverware, jewelry, antique furniture, and rare books were sold off in batches, often fetching millions, but these were one-time windfalls, not sustainable income. The most symbolic of these was the Biltmore Estate's transformation into a tourist attraction. Once the private playground of George Washington Vanderbilt II, it opened to the public in 1930 as a desperate measure to generate revenue during the Great Depression. Today, it is still a major tourist site, but no longer a private family home. By the late 20th century, the image of a Vanderbilt strolling through acres of marble halls was mostly a thing of memory and museum tours. Many descendants lived in comfortable but unremarkable homes, their lifestyles funded by ordinary salaries or smaller personal investments. Some went into academia, journalism, or politics, professions that earned prestige but not the kind of wealth the family once commanded. A few still attended elite schools and maintained social connections, but these were more symbolic than financial. The railroads that had built the fortune were, by the 1970s, almost entirely absorbed by conglomerates and public entities. The once mighty New York Central Railroad merged with the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1968, forming Penn Central, a disaster of corporate culture clash and financial mismanagement. By 1970, Penn Central had declared the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. This was more than a business loss. It was a symbolic death. The Vanderbilt Empire's industrial foundation was gone, erased from the corporate map. Other great fortunes of the 19th century, the Rockefellers, the Fords, the DuPonts, managed to retain influence through family trusts, corporate holdings, or philanthropic foundations that preserved both wealth and legacy. The Vanderbilts, by contrast, never institutionalized their fortune. There was no family council, no central estate management, and no agreed-upon strategy for preserving capital. Every heir was left to navigate the modern economy on their own terms, and most were unprepared for it. By the 1980s, the Vanderbilts had become more of a historical curiosity than a living power. Their story was told in documentaries, glossy coffee table books, and the guided tours of Biltmore. Visitors could marvel at the grandeur, but the family itself had little direct role in shaping America's future. Some found liberation in this shift. Without the crushing expectations of empire maintenance, younger Vanderbilts could pursue careers in art, fashion, or social advocacy. Others struggled with the shadow of a name that carried more weight in history books than on bank ledgers. In the public eye, a few figures kept the name alive. Gloria Vanderbilt's designer jeans empire briefly returned the family to pop culture relevance in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Her son, Anderson Cooper, became a respected journalist, though he has famously said he expects no inheritance, a stark contrast to the assumptions of his 19th century ancestors. Other descendants live private lives, scattered across the country, connected more by bloodlines than by any shared fortune or grand estate. The Vanderbilt's trajectory has been studied by economists, sociologists, and historians as a prime example of the three-generation rule. The idea that wealth is built by one generation, maintained by the next, and often lost by the third. In the Vanderbilt's case, the decline stretched a bit longer, but the pattern held true. They rose higher than kings in their age, commanding industries, dictating fashion, and building architectural wonders. But they lacked the structures and discipline to weather changing times. And in the end, the tides of history carried their fortune away. Today, the name Vanderbilt still evokes power, glamour, and the excesses of the Gilded Age. Biltmore continues to attract over 1 million visitors a year. Historians and the public alike remain fascinated by the sheer scale of their former wealth, and by the almost Shakespearean tragedy of its disappearance. The family's rise and fall stands as both a cautionary tale and a reminder: in America, even royalty must continually reinvent itself or risk becoming a footnote. By the early decades of the 20th century, the Vanderbilts were no longer simply America's preeminent railroad family. They had become a sprawling dynasty whose interests stretched far beyond the steel tracks that had made their fortune. The children and grandchildren of Cornelius Vanderbilt II and William Kissam Vanderbilt I inherited not only vast wealth but also a cultural expectation that they would live in ways befitting an American royal house. Yet, with each generation, the nature of that expectation changed. The age of railroads was fading. The public no longer viewed industrial magnates with awe, but with suspicion. And for the Vanderbilts, this shift would shape the decisions and the mistakes of those who inherited the empire. No figure captured the early 20th century shift in Vanderbilt identity, quite like William Kissam Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore and son of the first William Kissam Vanderbilt. Known to friends simply as Willie K, he was less interested in railroads and boardrooms than in speed, engineering, and the romance of the open road. His passion for automobiles made him one of America's earliest champions of motor racing, a pursuit that was thrilling, extravagant, and almost entirely unprofitable. In 1904, Willie K launched the Vanderbilt Cup, the first major international automobile race in the United States. At the time, American roads were little more than dusty, rutted paths, but the Vanderbilt Cup brought sleek European race cars roaring through Long Island's countryside. The event became a sensation, attracting hundreds of thousands of spectators, but it also drew controversy. Fatal crashes were common, and local authorities began to worry about safety and congestion. Willie K's solution was to build his own road. The Vanderbilt Parkway, completed in 1908, was one of the first roads in America designed specifically for automobile travel. Smooth, wide, and privately funded, it was a marvel of its time. But it was also a perfect metaphor for the new Vanderbilt era, an enormous private project undertaken more for personal passion and public spectacle than for long-term profit. The parkway eventually became part of the public highway system, but for the Vanderbilt fortune, it was an expensive monument to leisure rather than enterprise. When not racing, Willie K retreated to Idlehour, his palatial estate on Long Island. Set on more than 900 acres, Idlehour was a study in Gilded Age excess. Sprawling gardens, grand halls, a private yacht dock. Guests recalled weekends filled with hunting parties, sailing excursions, and lavish dinners that seemed to go on for hours. Yet even as Willie K entertained the cream of New York society, the world outside was changing. The railroads that had built the Vanderbilt name were losing their monopoly, and public sentiment was turning against hereditary wealth. Willie K was admired for his charm, but he was not the kind of Vanderbilt who built empires. He enjoyed them, and enjoyment, as history would show, could be costly. While Willie K sought thrills, his cousin Emily Thorne Vanderbilt chose a quieter, more socially conscious path. The daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt I, Emily grew up steeped in privilege but became known for her extensive philanthropy. In an era when wealthy women were often confined to charity as a socially acceptable outlet for ambition, Emily made it her domain. She funded hospitals, schools, and housing projects, often focusing on improving conditions for the working poor in New York City. Emily's life also bridged the worlds of old money and new celebrity. Through marriage, her extended family eventually connected to actor Timothy Oliphant, a reminder that the Vanderbilt name continued to weave itself into unexpected corners of American culture. But for Emily herself, the allure was never fame. She preferred to operate out of the spotlight, using her resources to fund practical, tangible improvements in people's lives. Yet even philanthropy could not entirely shield her from the economic realities of the time. The income from the Vanderbilt fortune, though still vast, was no longer an inexhaustible spring. Real estate taxes, maintenance costs, and a shift away from monopolistic rail profits meant that even charitable giving had to be balanced against dwindling returns. Emily's generation of Vanderbilts would be the last to assume that their children's children would be just as wealthy as they were. By the 1920s, the contrast between the Vanderbilts who spent and the Vanderbilts who preserved had become stark. The older generation, those who had lived through the empire's rise, understood the machinery that had produced their fortune. They remembered the Commodore's shrewdness, his relentless efficiency, and the iron discipline he imposed on himself and his family. The younger generation inherited the proceeds without the process. This was not unique to the Vanderbilts. Across America, the great industrial fortunes of the Gilded Age were dispersing. Some families adapted, moving into banking, oil, or manufacturing. Others, like the Vanderbilts, diversified in ways that had more to do with lifestyle than with building new empires. Grand estates, racing ventures, and extensive philanthropy may have enriched public life, but they did little to replace the capital being spent. Still, in these years of expansion, the family remained a cultural force. Their balls and weddings made newspaper headlines. Their estates were architectural marvels studied by designers. Their patronage of the arts and philanthropy shaped institutions that still exist today. Yet, beneath the polished surface, the conditions that had created the Vanderbilt dominance were eroding. What looked like expansion was, in truth, the first chapter of decline. If William Kissam Vanderbilt II embodied the era's thirst for speed, and Emily Vanderbilt its conscience, Florence Adele Vanderbilt Twombly represented its discipline, a rare quality among the younger Vanderbilts. Daughter of Hamilton McCown Twombly and Florence Adele Vanderbilt, she grew up in an atmosphere of almost regal control. Florence was not a headline chaser. She rarely appeared in the society columns, except when she wished to, and even then, her image was carefully managed. Unlike some of her cousins, Florence understood that wealth was not invulnerable. She was a master of high society politics, capable of seating the right person at the right table, funding the right charity at the right moment, and keeping her family's name above scandal. She inherited Florham, a grand New Jersey estate that stood as both fortress and stage. Fortress, in that it was guarded from unwanted intrusion; stage, in that it hosted some of the most strategically curated gatherings of the Gilded Age elite. Guests left her soiree speaking less of the champagne and more of the connections they had made there, connections Florence had engineered. Her power was quiet, almost invisible, but it was real. She did not waste wealth on reckless ventures. Instead, she preserved it by wielding influence. Yet even Florence could not stop the tide of change. High society itself was shifting. The old guard of 400 families, once ruled by the likes of Mrs. Astor and Mrs. Astor, Vanderbilt, was being diluted by the arrival of new money from oil, film, and finance. The Vanderbilts were no longer the unquestioned rulers of New York society. They were part of a larger, more competitive aristocracy. Florence could play the game skillfully, but the game board itself had changed. While some members of the family fought to maintain their social relevance, Frederick William Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore, lived as though the race for prominence had already been decided. He was perhaps the most financially cautious of his generation, a man who invested conservatively and avoided the excesses that consumed some of his relatives. Frederick's estate on the Hudson River in Hyde Park, New York, was elegant but not ostentatious by Vanderbilt standards. He was a keen yachtsman and an avid traveler, but his pleasures were measured. Unlike Willie K.'s lavish racetrack projects or the vast Newport mansions, Frederick's lifestyle was designed to endure rather than impress. When Frederick died in 1938 without children, his will made headlines, not for the sums it passed to relatives, but for the fortune it left to charity. Much of his wealth was directed to hospitals, universities, and public works. It was as if, recognizing the inevitable dissipation of the family fortune, he had chosen to place what remained in institutions that might last longer than the Vanderbilt name in society columns. By the time the Great Depression struck in 1929, the Vanderbilt's position had already weakened. The crash merely accelerated a process that had been unfolding for decades, the erosion of an industrial fortune in a post-industrial world. Taxes on enormous estates soared. Maintaining multiple mansions, yachts, and staffs became unsustainable, even for the wealthy. Some Vanderbilts sold their properties, others closed them for good. The Biltmore estate in North Carolina, once a family retreat, was transformed into a public attraction in order to keep it from financial collapse. Idle Hour burned in 1899 and was rebuilt, only to later be abandoned as a primary residence. The once proud Fifth Avenue mansions that had symbolized Gilded Age dominance were torn down, replaced by commercial buildings. The irony was stark. While the Vanderbilt name still carried cultural weight, the fortune that had built it was fragmenting. Each generation's inheritances were smaller, and the idea of a unified Vanderbilt empire was more myth than reality. What makes this period of Vanderbilt history so compelling is its dual nature. On one hand, there was undeniable expansion, into philanthropy, into new industries, into cultural influence beyond railroads. The family built roads, funded charities, and shaped society in ways that went beyond financial dominance. On the other hand, this very expansion marked the beginning of decline. The railroads had been a near monopoly. Their profits were concentrated and controllable. Racing cups, grand estates, and charitable foundations were diffuse. The family was no longer united by a single business venture. Instead, they were bound, loosely, by a shared name and the memory of a fortune that once seemed eternal. In many ways, the Vanderbilts of this era lived in the afterglow of a sunset. They could still see the brilliance of what had been built, but the source of that light was disappearing beyond the horizon. For the public, they were still symbols of American aristocracy. For those inside the family, they were beginning to grapple with an uncomfortable truth: wealth, no matter how vast, is not immune to time. When George Washington Vanderbilt II first set eyes upon the rolling slopes and mist-cloaked ridges of North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains in the late 1880s, he saw not simply land. He saw a vision. To most men, the remote hills would have been a place for a hunting lodge or a rustic summer retreat, but George was not most men. He was the youngest son of William Henry Vanderbilt, heir to a fortune vast enough to make any dream possible. And in his mind, the mountains would cradle not a modest home, but the largest private residence in the entire United States. It would be a place where art, architecture, science, and nature would be woven together in one monumental statement. A place that whispered of European palaces, yet spoke with an American voice. The idea for Biltmore was born during George's travels in Europe. Unlike his older brothers, who were consumed by finance, yachts, and the New York social scene, George was a quiet intellectual. He preferred the hush of libraries to the clamor of Wall Street, the fragrance of gardens to the smoke of the railroad yards. In France, he had wandered through the chateaux of the Loire Valley, studying their symmetry and romance. In England, he had walked the great estates of landed aristocrats, absorbing their balance between home and landscape. And in Italy, he had lingered in Renaissance palazzi, noting how architecture could project both wealth and culture. When he purchased 105,000 acres in western North Carolina in 1888, he carried all those impressions with him, and he meant to outdo them all. To bring his dream to life, George hired the most celebrated architect of the American Gilded Age, Richard Morris Hunt, the same man who had designed several grand Vanderbilt mansions in New York and Newport. Hunt's plan for Biltmore was nothing short of audacious. A 105,000 square foot French Renaissance chateau rising from the Carolina wilderness, with steeply pitched roofs, elaborate turrets, and limestone facades quarried and shipped from Indiana. For the surrounding grounds, George turned to none other than Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of American landscape architecture and designer of Central Park. Olmsted envisioned not just manicured gardens, but an entire environmental transformation, reforesting hillsides stripped by logging, sculpting roads to reveal breathtaking views, and creating a self-sustaining estate that could feed itself from its own farms, dairies, and greenhouses. Construction began in 1889, and over the next 6 years, an army of masons, carpenters, and craftsmen worked on the estate. Materials poured in from across the country and Europe, marble from Italy, oak from America's finest forests, tiles from Spain, and tapestries from Belgium. The scale of the work was staggering. More than 1,000 workers lived in a nearby village built specifically for them, complete with housing, a hospital, and a school. While cities like New York and Chicago roared with industry, a quiet but equally ambitious enterprise unfolded in the Carolina Hills, all at the will and expense of one man. On Christmas Eve, 1895, Biltmore opened its doors. Guests stepping into the grand entrance hall were greeted by a 7-story-high spiral staircase of carved stone, light filtering down through a glass roof. The banquet hall soared to 70 feet, with a triple fireplace so large a man could stand inside it without stooping, and a 1916 Skinner pipe organ whose notes could fill the entire house. There were 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms for family and guests, 43 bathrooms, a shocking luxury at the time, and 65 fireplaces. The library held more than 10,000 volumes in multiple languages, reflecting George's voracious reading. In the winter garden, a glass-roofed conservatory, palms and orchids bloomed even in January. Everything, every hinge, every sconce, every tapestry, had been chosen by George himself with an eye for harmony and beauty. Yet Biltmore was more than a palace of stone and glass. It was a working estate, a microcosm of George's ideals. Olmsted's plans created a patchwork of formal gardens, farmland, and managed forests. The dairy produced milk, butter, and cheese for the estate and surrounding community. Orchards yielded apples and peaches. The forestry program was among the first of its kind in the nation, pioneering sustainable practices decades before conservation became a mainstream concern. For George, the estate was not merely for display, it was to be a living, breathing organism. Still, the sheer scale of Biltmore was a financial burden, even for a Vanderbilt. George had inherited considerable wealth, but unlike his father and grandfather, he was not inclined toward aggressive business ventures. His fortune was a reservoir, not a river, and the outflow was enormous. The estate required hundreds of staff, from gardeners and carpenters to maids and cooks. Heating the house alone in winter consumed mountains of coal. Every banquet, every social season was another strain on resources. Yet in the early years, George seemed unconcerned. He entertained writers, artists, and scientists, believing Biltmore could be a beacon of culture in the American South. In 1898, George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, a woman of refinement and strong character. Together, they had one daughter, Cornelia, who would grow up as the sole heir to the estate. The family lived quietly compared to other Vanderbilts, preferring the rhythms of country life to the dizzying whirl of New York society. But they were not immune to history's tides. World War I brought shortages and a decline in the kind of wealth that had built Biltmore. By the 1920s, with new taxes on large estates and the slow erosion of the Vanderbilt fortune, maintaining Biltmore as a private home became nearly impossible. In 1930, Cornelia and her husband, John Cecil, made a bold decision. They opened Biltmore to the public. The move was partly financial, a way to generate income during the Great Depression, but it was also a gesture to preserve the estate's place in American heritage. Visitors paid a small fee to wander its grand halls and manicured gardens, marveling at a world that seemed impossibly far from their own. Over time, Biltmore evolved into a self-sustaining enterprise, with guided tours, a winery, and festivals that drew tourists from across the nation. The estate that had once been a private sanctuary of wealth became one of the most visited historic homes in the United States. Today, Biltmore stands not just as a relic of Gilded Age opulence, but as a testament to vision, adaptation, and survival. While the other great Vanderbilt houses, Marble House, the Breakers, Petit Chateau, have become museums or vanished altogether, Biltmore remains alive, still owned by descendants of George Vanderbilt. The forests Olmsted planted now cloak the hills in deep green. The gardens bloom as they did a century ago. The great banquet hall still echoes with voices, though now they are those of tourists and guides rather than aristocrats and tycoons. The Biltmore legacy is bittersweet. It represents the pinnacle of what money and imagination can create, but also the precariousness of great wealth when not anchored by a sustainable future. George Vanderbilt's dream outlived him, yet it also outgrew the fortune that built it. In its transformation from private palace to public treasure, Biltmore tells a larger story. about America's changing relationship with wealth, about the fading of dynasties, and about the endurance of beauty even as empires fall. For visitors walking through its echoing halls today, Biltmore is both a marvel and a memorial. The marble shines, the tapestries glow in filtered sunlight, and the scent of fresh flowers drifts from the conservatory. Yet in every polished surface there is a reflection of a vanished world, a reminder of the family who once called it home, and the age that believed such grandeur would last forever. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Vanderbilts seemed unshakable, the very definition of American aristocracy. Their name adorned mansions on Fifth Avenue, yachts docked in Newport, and private railcars that gleamed like palaces on steel wheels. Yet, behind the polished oak doors and gilded drawing rooms, the family's empire had already begun to crack. The fall, when it came, would be sudden in some places, gradual in others, but inevitable all the same. The problem was not just the spending, though the scale of Vanderbilt extravagance is still breathtaking to recount. In an age when the average American family lived on less than $1,000 a year, some Vanderbilts were spending that in a single afternoon, on flowers, on imported champagne, on hosting dinners for 50. Entire wardrobes were discarded seasonally, and horses were kept simply because their coats matched the drapes in the stables. Yet this alone did not destroy them. The fortune was so large that it might have survived a century of carelessness if the world had stood still. But the world was changing. The railroads, which had been the very foundation of the Vanderbilt empire, were losing their supremacy. Automobiles were no longer toys for the curious rich. They were becoming the future. Roads were improving. Trucks were challenging freight trains. And the romance of the passenger locomotive was giving way to the convenience of personal travel. The great rail empires were slowing, and with them, the rivers of gold that had once flowed into the Vanderbilt accounts began to thin. The business acumen that had built the fortune was no longer in the family's veins. Cornelius, the Commodore. Vanderbilt had been a ruthless, calculating businessman who understood every turn of the economic tide. His son William had been a skilled steward of that fortune, but by the third generation, the heirs were often far removed from the mechanics of wealth creation. They were socialites, patrons, racers, gamblers, living off dividends and interest without understanding how fragile those numbers could be. Taxes, too, were tightening their grip. The United States, once a low-tax nation, began to impose heavier inheritance taxes and income taxes in the early 20th century. These were devastating to large fortunes that were tied up in estates, art collections, and non-liquid assets. A Vanderbilt heir might inherit a mansion worth $5 million, but have to sell half its contents just to pay the taxes on it. The costs of upkeep for their sprawling properties were astronomical. Fifth Avenue mansions required armies of servants. Newport cottages needed constant care. Biltmore alone employed hundreds. Every year, the fixed expenses mounted, while the family's actual income dwindled. But the Vanderbilts were trapped in the gilded world they had built. Selling off their opulence would have been seen as a public admission of decline. By the 1920s, the cracks were visible to anyone who looked closely. The Jazz Age roared with excess, but for the Vanderbilts, the parties masked a quiet desperation. Behind closed doors, financial advisors warned the properties must be sold, trust funds renegotiated, and spending slashed. For a family whose very identity was tied to grandeur, this was almost unthinkable. Many heirs preferred to pretend nothing had changed. The stock market crash of 1929 delivered the fatal blow. Fortunes across America were erased overnight, and while the Vanderbilts still held significant assets, the liquidity crisis was severe. Shares in railroads plummeted. Dividends vanished. The sprawling estates became millstones, impossible to maintain, yet heartbreaking to sell. Some heirs, clinging to dignity, sold their homes quietly and moved into smaller, more manageable residences. Others fell into debt, their jewels and paintings auctioned off in public sales that made headlines. The fall was not a single dramatic collapse, but rather a slow, humiliating unraveling. A century-long decline from unimaginable wealth to a scattering of modest inheritances. By mid-century, no Vanderbilt was counted among America's richest. The family that had once symbolized the very pinnacle of the Gilded Age had become a cautionary tale. If the first decades of the 20th century had been about ignoring the warning signs, the middle decades were about confronting them. often in the most public and painful ways possible. The Vanderbilts, once masters of New York's social season, were now making headlines not for grand balls, but for liquidation sales. The process began quietly. A few underused mansions on Fifth Avenue were sold to developers. The stately brownstones and marble palaces that had once formed the Vanderbilt Row were replaced by high-rise apartments and commercial buildings. These were discreet transactions at first, handled through intermediaries so the family name would not be directly attached to the sales. But soon, the scale of divestment could not be hidden. In 1925, the largest of the Fifth Avenue mansions, the triple-housed palace commissioned by William Henry Vanderbilt for his children, was sold and demolished. It had once been a living museum, filled with priceless art and rare antiques collected from Europe's greatest estates. Its destruction marked not just the loss of a building, but the symbolic end of an era. To old New York society, it was as if a crown jewel had been pried loose from the family crest. As the Depression deepened, even the Newport cottages, vast seaside mansions with more bedrooms than their owners could count, became impossible to maintain. The heating bills alone could have supported a small village. Servant wages, property taxes, and repairs drained bank accounts already stretched thin. Many of these homes were sold for a fraction of their construction cost. Some were abandoned altogether. The most painful decisions came when the family's treasures, the heirlooms that connected them to their ancestors, had to be sold. Auction houses in New York and London did brisk business with Vanderbilt possessions, old master paintings, Louis XVI furniture, silver services engraved with the family crest. The very items that had once dazzled guests at glittering dinners were now displayed in catalogues for strangers to buy. Newspapers covered these sales with a mix of fascination and schadenfreude, framing them as morality tales about the fleeting nature of wealth. For many Vanderbilts, the selling off was not just about money, it was about identity. They had been raised to believe they were American royalty, destined to live at a scale beyond the imagination of ordinary citizens. The idea that they might one day live in modest homes, drive ordinary cars, or even work for a living was unthinkable. Yet, for some, that is exactly what happened. A few descendants entered the workforce, in finance, in the arts, in academia. Not out of passion, but necessity. Others married into new fortunes, repeating the old pattern of wealth consolidation through strategic unions. One of the few constants in this period was Biltmore, the grand Asheville estate built by George Washington Vanderbilt. Though its upkeep was ruinously expensive, it became a lifeline. By opening the estate to the public during the Depression, the Vanderbilts were able to generate income while preserving their connection to the land. This move, unthinkable to earlier generations, reflected the new reality. Survival meant adaptation, and adaptation meant letting go of the old rules. By the 1950s, the once towering Vanderbilt fortune had been scattered into countless smaller holdings. In 1973, a study of America's richest families revealed a stunning fact. Not a single Vanderbilt was among the top millionaires of the nation. The family that had once been wealthier than the USS Treasury had, in less than a century, lost its financial crown. Yet the loss was not total. The Vanderbilts retained a kind of cultural capital, the allure of their name, the legends of their parties, the architectural marvels they had left behind. In a sense, their legacy had shifted from one of raw wealth to one of historical romance. The family became characters in the broader story of the Gilded Age, a cautionary chapter about how fortunes rise and fall, and how no dynasty, no matter how grand, is immune to the tides of time. For the surviving heirs, the lesson was bitter but undeniable. The Vanderbilt name might still open doors, but it could no longer pay the bills. The empire was gone, its riches melted away into taxes, maintenance costs, and the relentless march of economic change. What remained was a story, and like all great stories, it was both a warning and a wonder. Stand on Fifth Avenue today, and the world the Vanderbilts once ruled feels like a dream. The towering glass and steel facades, the endless river of yellow taxis, and the glow of digital billboards have erased the marble palaces and gaslit avenues of the Gilded Age. But if you look closely, if you listen past the city's roar, you can almost hear the faint echo of carriage wheels and champagne laughter, the whisper of silk gowns sweeping over marble floors. The Vanderbilts were never just a family, they were a phenomenon. Their wealth was a kind of gravitational force that bent the social order around them. They could outspend dukes and dazzle princesses, summon presidents to dinner, and build homes that looked like transplanted French chateaux. For a time, they seemed invincible, as if their fortune had placed them outside the normal human experience of scarcity, failure, or decline. But history has no patience for permanence. Just as the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, and the Medici discovered before them, dynasties live and die in the same way as the people who compose them. Through a mix of choice, chance, and change. The Vanderbilt story is both uniquely American and universally human. They were the children of a republic without a king, yet they crowned themselves with castles, coronets, and gold. They lived the fantasy and paid the price when the dream became too heavy to carry. By the mid-20th century, the family's sprawling mansions had been sold or demolished, their art scattered to private collections and museum walls, their financial dominance erased from the ledgers of America's elite. And yet, in losing everything material, they gained something strange and enduring. They became legends. The American imagination, always fascinated by the rise and fall arc, locked the Vanderbilts into a mythic space, not unlike Gatsby's Green Light or Orson Welles' Rosebud. Walk into the Metropolitan Museum of Art and you might pass a Vanderbilt donation, a Rembrandt here, a medieval tapestry there. In Newport, Rhode Island, tourists pay to wander through the rooms where Gilded Age society once danced and drank, gawking at ceilings painted with cherubs and staircases carved like sculpture. At Biltmore in North Carolina, visitors can still trace the vision of George Washington Vanderbilt, imagining what it must have been like to host grand banquets in the banquet hall or read by firelight in the library with its 10,000 volumes. These preserved spaces are more than monuments. They are time capsules, each room a still life of a vanished world. And in these rooms, the contradictions of the Vanderbilt's legacy come into focus. On one hand, they represent the pinnacle of American ambition, the belief that with enough grit, vision, and audacity, one could rise from ferryboat captain's son to lord of railroads and steel. On the other, they stand as a warning: unchecked wealth without discipline can vanish faster than it is earned. There is also an undeniable romance in their decline. In an age when billionaires build bunkers and hoard fortunes in offshore accounts, there's something almost cinematic about a family that spent until the well ran dry. Their parties, their art, their homes, all of it was a kind of theatre, and when the curtain fell, the stage was left empty but still lit in memory. That is why the Vanderbilts remain a subject of fascination for historians, novelists, and filmmakers. They embody the tension between splendor and fragility, between the hunger for beauty and the inevitability of loss. But the reflection cannot end with nostalgia. The Vanderbilt's trajectory invites hard questions about wealth itself. Is a fortune truly lost when it is dispersed into public works, art collections, and historic preservation? Or does it simply change form, moving from private to public hands? Cornelius Vanderbilt may have died believing his empire would remain intact for generations, but perhaps the real legacy lies in what those riches left behind for the world to enjoy, and in the cautionary lessons etched into the family name. In the end, the Vanderbilt story is not about trains, mansions, or even money. It is about the fleeting nature of power, the human tendency to believe in our own permanence, and the way history has of humbling every dynasty in turn. Their marble halls may be gone, but their ghost still lingers in the American imagination. In the American imagination, and in the quiet truth that no fortune, may how vast, can outrun. In the Gilded Age, they were held up as proof of the American dream, an almost mythical testament to the idea that one man's vision, discipline, and relentlessness could defy the limits of class and background. Cornelius Vanderbilt began with nothing more than grit, a shrewd mind, and a willingness to work harder and risk more than his competition. By the time he died in 1877, he had amassed a fortune so vast that newspapers struggled to describe it without resorting to metaphors drawn from kings and emperors. But by the late 20th century, the family's economic power had evaporated. The once mighty Vanderbilt name, which could open any door in New York or Newport, no longer guaranteed wealth, status, or even recognition. It's tempting to read this as failure, to see their trajectory as a cautionary tale about indulgence and mismanagement. And yes, it is that. But it is also something more subtle and profound, a demonstration of how wealth, in its purest form, is a living thing. It needs to be tended, protected, and, above all, given purpose. Without that, it slips away as surely as water through open fingers. In this way, the Vanderbilt story feels eerily modern. We live in another age of vast fortunes, of billionaires whose net worths climb higher than the GDPs of small nations. We watch as tech moguls, hedge fund titans, and real estate empires build their own palaces, host their own elite gatherings, and court the same risks of overreach and public backlash that the Vanderbilts once did. The difference is that today's dynasties are armed with more tools, legal, financial, and technological, to protect their assets from erosion. And yet, history suggests that even the most sophisticated planning can only delay, not prevent, the eventual dispersal of wealth. There is a broader lesson here for anyone, whether or not they have millions in the bank. Fortunes, like health, youth, or influence, are transient. They demand stewardship, humility, and a clear-eyed understanding that they are not, in the end, ours to keep forever. What made Cornelius Vanderbilt so formidable was not just his ability to make money, but his instinct for survival in competitive, volatile markets. What undid later generations was not just extravagance, but a lack of that same hunger, the same willingness to adapt when the world shifted under their feet. Perhaps the greatest irony is that, while the Vanderbilts lost their fortune, they never lost their place in cultural memory. In many ways, that is a richer form of immortality than money can buy. Their story continues to be told, in books, documentaries, museum tours, and whispered legends about the excesses of the Gilded Age. And every retelling shapes their image anew, sometimes as visionaries, sometimes as cautionary figures, and often as both. The physical remains of their empire, the Biltmore estate, the breakers in Newport, a handful of surviving townhouses in Manhattan, are now part of the public's heritage. Stripped of their private exclusivity, they have become open stages for imagining a past that was at once dazzling and deeply flawed. Visitors marvel at the scale of the architecture, the opulence of the interiors, the sheer audacity of lives lived on such a grand scale. And in those marble halls, there is always a ghostly undertone, the knowledge that all this grandeur could not protect its owners from the slow, relentless work of time. It is fitting, then, that the Vanderbilts' most enduring legacy might not be their wealth or their mansions, but the questions they leave us with. What is the purpose of great fortune? Is it to display, to preserve, to grow, to give away? Can the creation of beauty and the pursuit of ambition justify the excesses they require? Or do such empires inevitably collapse under the weight of their own contradictions? For modern dynasties, and for anyone tempted to believe in the permanence of their own success, the Vanderbilts stand as both inspiration and warning. They prove that it is possible to climb higher than kings. They also prove that from such heights, the fall can be swift and the landing hard. And yet, there is one last truth that keeps their story from being purely tragic. The Vanderbilts lived. They inhabited a moment in history when to be bold was to be magnificent, when the boundaries of taste, ambition, and possibility were pushed to their outer limits. In the sweep of history, their fortune was brief, but in that brief span, they burned brighter than almost any family before or since. And because of that, their name will not fade. In the end, the Vanderbilts remind us that every fortune is a story. And like all stories, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The marble halls crumble, the bank accounts drain, the titles lose their meaning. But the tale remains, a flicker of light in the vast darkness of time, waiting to be told again.